The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the jagged desert cliffs surrounding the Apache village, casting long reddish shadows across the rough stone and adobe huts. The air was dry, scented faintly with sage and smoke from small hearths. In the heart of the village, the communal dining area buzzed softly with the sound of chatter and the scraping of wooden spoons against clay bowls. Families gathered, sharing the day's simple meals: dried meats, roasted corn, and berries gathered from the nearby mesas. Yet, amid this ordinary scene, a quiet tension was about to unfold that would ripple through the village for days to come. Ayoka, a young Apache woman known for her gentle demeanor and unwavering diligence, returned from the outskirts of the village, where she had spent the entire morning collecting herbs for medicine and firewood to fuel the communal hearths. Her hands were streaked with dirt, and her clothing bore the marks of her labor torn at the hem, smudged with mud and dust. She carried herself with careful grace, trying not to draw attention. But the telltale signs of her work were impossible to hide. Chaitin, a respected elder in the village and a man whose authority was rarely questioned, noticed her immediately. His eyes narrowed as he observed the dirt on her hands, the grime on her clothes, and the small flecks of mud caught in her braided hair. A frown creased his weathered face, and his voice carried a sharp edge as he called to the others around the communal table. "She cannot eat with us today," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She is unclean. Let her sit outside." A ripple of murmurs passed through the gathered villagers. Some, particularly the younger men and women, exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to speak up. Others simply nodded, accepting Chaitin's decree without question. Tradition, after all, dictated strict rules about cleanliness and the order of the household, and challenging an elder was considered dangerous and disrespectful. Ayoka's heart sank, but she bowed her head, feeling a mix of humiliation and simmering anger. To be forced to eat outdoors, exposed to the glaring sun, the dust swirling at her feet, and the eyes of the entire village was more than embarrassing. It was a statement of shame, a declaration that she was lesser, undeserving of the dignity of sitting among her family and neighbors. Yet, despite the humiliation, she knew better than to openly defy Chaitin in that moment. Quietly, she walked to the edge of the dining area, her bare feet kicking up tiny puffs of dust with each step. She set down her bowl on a flat stone and sat, staring at the ground. Around her, the village's life continued: laughter, conversation, the scraping of bowls, but she felt entirely isolated. Every sound seemed magnified in her ears, every glance a reminder of her forced separation. Her mother, Nokomis, watched from a distance, her face etched with worry. She knew Chaitin's punishment was harsh, but the weight of tradition and respect for elders kept her from intervening. She could only offer Ayoka a brief, sorrowful glance, a silent message of empathy and hope. As Ayoka lifted the spoon to her mouth, she could feel the eyes of the village on her, some curious, some judgmental, and some, she suspected, quietly sympathetic. The food tasted bland in her mouth, not because it lacked flavor, but because the shame had hollowed out her appetite. Yet, even in that moment of quiet suffering, a small flame of defiance began to flicker within her. She would not let this humiliation define her. Though her hands were dirt-streaked and her body weary, Ayoka straightened her back and met the sky above the desert with a quiet resolve. Somewhere in her mind, she made a vow. One day, she would claim her place in the village without fear or shame. And no one, not even Chaitin, would ever force her to bow to humiliation again. The day after Ayoka had been forced to eat outdoors, the village stirred with an uneasy energy. While life in the settlement usually followed a predictable rhythm, the previous incident had left a ripple of tension among the villagers. Morning sunlight spilled across the adobe huts, glinting off the clay pots and casting long shadows over the rough-hewn benches of the communal dining area. Yet, in this serene, sun-drenched morning, there was an undercurrent of whispered judgments and subtle glances. Ayoka moved carefully through the village, carrying water from the nearby spring in a worn clay jug. Her clothes were already dirt-streaked again from her labor in the fields, and despite the cool morning breeze, the warmth of embarrassment still clung to her. Villagers gave her a wide berth, some avoiding her gaze, others muttering under their breath. Though she tried to ignore them, each glance and whispered comment pierced her like a small stone. Leaving her uneasy and exposed, her mother, Nokomis, observed the situation from the doorway of their hut, her heart heavy with concern. She had seen her daughter's proud spirit dim ever so slightly under Chaitin's cruel judgment. Nokomis knew that publicly challenging the elder was fraught with danger. Chaitin's influence ran deep, and his authority was rarely questioned. Still, a simmering worry tugged at her conscience. "The child has done no wrong," she muttered under her breath, as if speaking aloud might somehow restore justice. Meanwhile, across the village, the chatter among the young men and women hinted at shifting perceptions. Small clusters gathered under the shade of mesquite trees, voices hushed but alive with speculation. "Why should she be treated this way?" A young man whispered. "She works harder than many of us," a woman countered softly. The conversation spread slowly, like sparks catching on dry grass, yet no one dared speak directly against Chaitin. The fear of social backlash was tangible. Tradition's weight pressed down upon them all. Ayoka, sensing their muted curiosity and hesitant support, began to feel a subtle stirring within herself. She realized that while Chaitin's judgment had forced her to the margins of the dining area, it could not reach her inner resolve. She spent the morning quietly tending to her tasks, gathering firewood and checking the herbs she had planted near the hut. With each careful movement, she felt the tension within her slowly transform into determination. She would endure the shame, yes, but she would also not let it crush her spirit. As she worked, she noticed Takoda approaching along the narrow dirt path. Takoda was a young man respected for his fairness, known for quietly observing the world with a discerning eye. He stopped a few paces away, neither too close nor too distant, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "Ayoka," he said gently, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and quiet admiration. "You need not bear this alone." Ayoka's eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, the weight on her shoulders seemed lighter. Takoda spoke further, carefully avoiding confrontation but planting seeds of hope. "Everyone in this village labors with dirt on their hands at times," he said. "To be called unclean for doing what is necessary, it does not sit right with me." His words were not a bold challenge to Chaitin, yet they carried the power of empathy, a quiet affirmation of Ayoka's dignity. Through their brief exchange, Ayoka felt a flicker of courage ignite within her. Perhaps she was not entirely alone. Perhaps, despite the harshness of tradition, there were others willing to see reason and fairness. She returned to her chores with a steadier step, the humiliation from the previous day still lingering but now mingled with a quiet, resolve. As the sun climbed higher into the clear desert sky, Ayoka understood something crucial. The power of tradition could bend her body, force her outside, and strip her of comfort, but it could not yet touch her heart. And in that realization, a small but vital spark of defiance began to glow, ready to grow in the days to come. The following days passed with a quiet tension settling over the village like dust after a desert wind. Ayoka continued her daily chores, collecting firewood, tending the small herb garden near her family's hut, and assisting other villagers where needed, but every task now carried the weight of Chaitin's judgment. She could feel the invisible eyes of the elder upon her, assessing her movements, measuring the dirtiness of her hands and the supposed unworthiness of her presence. Each glance, each whisper, added fuel to the fire of her growing frustration. It was during one of these long afternoons, as she bent over a patch of sagebrush to pull weeds and loosen the soil, that Dakota approached her again. He moved quietly, his steps barely disturbing the dust beneath the mesquite trees. Unlike Chayton, Dakota's presence brought no sharp edges, no judgment, only a calm awareness that seemed to acknowledge both her suffering and her strength. "Ayoka," he said softly, standing just beyond the reach of her immediate work, "why do you let him dictate your place here? You labor like anyone else. Does the dirt on your hands make your heart any less honorable?" Ayoka paused, the small wooden trowel still in her hand. She wanted to say something, to speak her frustration aloud, yet words felt inadequate. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but firm. "He says I am dirty, that I do not belong inside the communal meals, that I am less than the others because I work." Dakota's eyes met hers, steady and compassionate. "And yet here you are, standing strong, doing what must be done for this village. Tell me, if your labor earns you respect, if your work nourishes others, how can he call you unclean?" Ayoka looked down at her dirt-streaked hands, and for the first time, she considered them not as symbols of shame, but as marks of endurance, of service, and of life lived fully. Dakota's words stirred something deep within her, a seed of defiance that had been quietly germinating since the first time she had been forced outdoors. Over the next few days, their meetings became a quiet ritual. Dakota would find her in the fields or near the hearth, offering small encouragements. He did not openly confront Chayton. He was careful not to provoke the elder's ire. But his presence alone gave Ayoka the courage to see herself differently. He spoke of fairness, of honor, and of dignity that transcended appearances, each conversation reinforcing the belief that she did not have to accept humiliation passively. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert sky in hues of orange and purple, Dakota spoke a simple, yet revolutionary truth. "You have the right to claim your place among the people of this village. Tradition has power, yes, but it is the courage of those who question injustice that shapes the soul of a community." The words echoed in Ayoka's mind long after Dakota had left. She felt a fire growing inside her, a determination that refused to be quelled by fear or shame. She began to see the dirt on her hands not as a mark of unworthiness, but as a badge of survival, a testament to her contribution, and a challenge to the rigid social norms that sought to confine her. That night, as Ayoka lay beneath the open sky, listening to the whispering wind among the mesquite trees, she made a vow. She would no longer shrink from the eyes of the village. She would no longer accept humiliation as a measure of her value. And with Dakota's quiet guidance giving her courage, she would one day stand not quietly, not in the shadows, but openly against the injustice that had sought to diminish her, unseen by the village. A small but powerful defiance had taken root in Ayoka's heart, and as the stars began to glimmer across the desert sky, she knew that the next step she would take would not only reclaim her dignity but could also inspire others to question the unfairness that had been accepted. For far too long days passed in the village with a foul tension that simmered like a desert heat wave, invisible yet unmistakable. Chayton, the elder who wielded authority like a sharpened blade, began to escalate his punishments. Each day he found new ways to remind Ayoka of her place in the social order. One morning, as the villagers gathered to eat, he motioned sharply toward the edge of the dining area. "Outside," he commanded, his voice cutting through the morning chatter like a whip. "You will eat with the wind and dust where you belong." Ayoka's stomach twisted, but she did not respond with tears or pleading. Instead, she obeyed silently, carrying her bowl with steady hands, feeling the eyes of every villager upon her. Children stared, some with curiosity, some with unease, while adults whispered among themselves. The act of eating outdoors had become a daily ritual of shame, and yet, paradoxically, it was also where Ayoka began to cultivate her quiet resistance. Inside the communal area, Chaitin watched with satisfaction, certain that his display would reinforce his authority. Yet he underestimated the subtle power of dignity. Ayoka's posture remained straight. Her eyes did not flinch when they met the eyes of others. There was no overt defiance, but an unmistakable calm strength radiated from her. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in the context of the village's rigid hierarchy, it was remarkable. Takoda, observing from a respectful distance, continued to support her in subtle ways. He left extra food and water at the edge of the seating area, ensuring she would not go hungry. He did not confront Chaitin directly. He understood the elder's authority too well, but he provided Ayoka with small gestures of solidarity, a reminder that she was not entirely alone. Each act of quiet support was a thread weaving the beginning of a network of courage. Within Ayoka, the humiliation was slowly transforming into something more complex. Her anger was no longer raw. It was tempered by awareness and resolve. She began to see the injustice not as an inevitable truth, but as a challenge to be confronted in its own time. Every forced meal outdoors, every whispered comment from the villagers became fuel for her growing determination. She was learning to endure without surrendering, to accept the temporary shame while nurturing the spark of defiance inside her. The villagers themselves began to feel the ripple effects. Some were unsettled by Chaitin's rigid enforcement, particularly the younger men and women who had begun to question the fairness of his judgment. Murmurs of dissent floated through the shaded spaces under the mesquite trees, small voices challenging long-held assumptions. Why should hard work make someone unclean? One whispered. Another replied softly, perhaps it is time to reconsider what respect really means. Though fear of Chaitin's authority kept most silent, the seeds of questioning were being planted. One afternoon, as Ayoka cleaned the herbs she had gathered earlier, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a shallow pool of water. Her hands were smudged with dirt, her hair slightly disheveled, and yet her eyes held something different: steadiness, awareness, and the first glimmers of quiet defiance. She realized that Chaitin's punishment, though intended to humiliate, could not reach the part of her that knew her own worth. Her labor, her care, and her resilience had not gone unnoticed, and that realization gave her a new strength. By the end of the day, the pattern was clear. Chaitin continued his punishments, but Ayoka was no longer simply a passive victim. She had begun to resist internally, cultivating her dignity like a hidden treasure. Each forced meal outdoors became less about humiliation and more about preparation for the moment when she could stand openly, when her courage would no longer be confined to quiet glances and whispered thoughts. And in the quiet moments of the desert evening, as the wind rustled through the mesquite leaves and the sun sank behind the cliffs, Ayoka allowed herself a small, private smile. She was learning not just to endure but to grow stronger in the face of injustice, knowing that one day her defiance would no longer need to be hidden. The days in the village stretched long under the unyielding sun, but change, though subtle, was beginning to stir beneath the surface. While Chaitin continued to enforce his rigid rules with an iron hand, the villagers themselves were beginning to shift in ways that were not immediately visible. The harsh punishment that had been imposed on Ayoka, forcing her to eat outdoors because she was dirty, had not gone unnoticed, and murmurs of quiet dissent began to ripple through the community. Elder women, who had long been the silent guardians of both tradition and compassion, began exchanging discreet glances when Chaitin's voice rang out. Some shook their heads slowly, disapproval hidden behind polite masks. They spoke in hushed tones among themselves, questioning the fairness of punishing a woman simply for performing the necessary labor of daily survival. "Is this truly the way of our people?" one whispered, her hand brushing a clay pot on the table as if seeking reassurance in its stability. "Does our respect for tradition mean we must shun the hard-working among us?" Ayoka noticed these quiet gestures, the sympathetic glances, the subtle shakes of the head, and the whispered conversations reached her even as she sat outside eating her meager meals. Each small act of acknowledgement became a lifeline, a reminder that she was not completely isolated in her suffering. Though the elders did not openly challenge Chaitin, their empathy gave her courage, and she began to feel the stirrings of a larger movement within the village, a movement that recognized fairness and dignity. Alongside tradition, Takota continued to play his part as a quiet ally. He did not confront Chaitin directly, knowing that such boldness would risk severe consequences, but his presence and support were unmistakable. He left water and food at her stone seat, spoke to her in private, and offered encouragement in ways that were discreet yet profound. "You are not alone," he reminded her one afternoon as she tended the garden. "The strength within you is reflected in the eyes of those who see justice, even if they are too afraid to speak it aloud." Ayoka began to respond to this growing undercurrent of support with small but significant acts of defiance. She straightened her back when sitting outdoors, refusing to shrink under the gaze of the village. Her eyes met those of passing children, some curious, some sympathetic, and she gave a quiet nod of acknowledgement, reclaiming small fragments of her dignity. Every gesture, no matter how small, was a declaration that she would not allow humiliation to define her. The younger villagers, in particular, began to take notice. Whispered conversations under the shade of mesquite trees grew bolder, questioning the logic of Chaitin's decrees. "She works harder than most men in this village," one youth remarked. "Shouldn't that earn her respect, not shame?" The words spread cautiously, but with each repetition, the idea of fairness gained momentum. The rigid hierarchy that had long governed behavior in the village was beginning to show cracks. Even Chaitin himself began to notice these subtle shifts. The once unquestioned authority he wielded now faced silent challenges from the corners of the village he could not control. Villagers avoided his eyes slightly more often, and small gestures of defiance, like passing supportive glances or quietly leaving space for Ayoka, unsettled him. Though he remained outwardly stern, he sensed that his dominance was no longer absolute by the end of the day. As the sun dipped low and cast long shadows over the village, Ayoka allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She understood that the path ahead would not be easy. Tradition was a strong current, and those who attempted to change it often faced resistance. Yet, the small stirrings of support from the villagers, combined with Takota's steady guidance, filled her with hope. She realized that the fight for dignity and fairness did not always have to be loud or immediate. It could grow quietly, nurtured by courage, empathy, and patience. And as night settled over the desert, Ayoka looked up at the stars glimmering above, feeling a sense of connection not only to the vast landscape, but to the people around her. Though the battle for respect had only just begun, she understood that even quiet defiance, when paired with support, could become a powerful force for change. The morning sun poured over the village in a golden haze, illuminating the dusty paths and adobe huts with a harsh clarity. The usual hum of activity, women tending fires, children running between huts, men preparing tools, carried an undercurrent of tension. Whispers from the previous days lingered like a shadow, and all eyes seemed subtly drawn to Ayoka as she carried her water jug along the narrow path to the spring. The memory of being forced to eat outdoors weighed on her still, but her growing resolve gave her steps purpose and steadiness. Takota had spent the previous nights wrestling with his own sense of duty. Watching Ayoka endure Chaitan's punishments in silence had stirred a fire within him, a conviction that justice demanded action. He knew openly defying Chaitan could provoke anger, perhaps even violence, but he also understood that silence would permit cruelty to persist. With careful consideration, he decided it was time to speak publicly, to voice what many villagers had only whispered in hushed tones. The moment arrived at the communal gathering. When villagers sat together sharing the morning meal, the air was thick with anticipation, for everyone sensed that the tension between tradition and justice had reached a tipping point. Chaitan sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the village with the authority he had wielded for decades. He had already noticed Takota's subtle support of Ayoka in private and was wary of any public challenge. Takota stepped forward, his voice steady but carrying the weight of conviction. "Chaitan," he said, his words clear and deliberate, "why do we shame those who work with their hands? Why do we call her unclean when she labors to provide for us all? Is this truly the measure of honor in our village?" A hush fell over the gathering. Some villagers held their breath, fearing the elder's reaction, while others leaned forward, listening intently. Takota's words, though simple, carried a truth that resonated with many who had quietly questioned Chaitan's actions but had lacked the courage to speak aloud. Chaitan's face tightened, and his voice rose, sharp and commanding. "Tradition guides us. Respect must be maintained. You speak of fairness, Takota, but you ignore the rules that have held this village together for generations." Takota did not falter. "Tradition is a guide, yes," he replied calmly, "but it must not blind us to cruelty. To punish her for being dirty from work is to punish life itself. To demand shame for doing what is necessary is not wisdom, it is injustice." A murmur spread among the villagers. Some nodded subtly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the elder women, who had quietly sympathized with Ayoka, straightened slightly, emboldened by Takota's courage. The ripple of dissent was beginning to swell, giving shape and voice to the long-suppressed questions about fairness and respect. Ayoka, standing slightly apart, felt her chest tighten with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time, she saw someone publicly defend her without hesitation, someone willing to risk Chaitan's wrath to uphold her dignity. A spark ignited within her, a realization that resistance was possible, that courage could manifest not only in whispered thoughts but in bold, public acts. Chaitan's scowl deepened, but he found himself momentarily uncertain. The murmurs of support, the subtle gestures of agreement, and the calm insistence in Takota's voice all converged to challenge his authority in a way he had not fully anticipated. For the first time in many years, he faced the possibility that his word alone might not dictate the moral compass of the village. By the time the gathering dispersed, a quiet tension remained in the air. Takota had spoken, and while the elder had not yet relented, a seed had been planted, a seed of doubt, a seed of change. Ayoka's heart swelled with cautious hope. The battle was far from over, but she now understood that courage could inspire others, that a single voice aligned with truth and justice could awaken the conscience of the community. As the sun climbed higher, Ayoka returned to her chores with renewed determination. The path ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer alone. With Takota's guidance and the subtle support of those who had begun to question injustice, she knew that the next step claiming her rightful place within the village was drawing nearer. The morning air in the village was crisp, carrying the faint scent of smoke from cooking fires and the sweet aroma of mesquite flowers. Villagers went about their routines, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a subtle tension that seemed to pulse through the sun-baked streets. Whispers of Takota's public confrontation with Chaitan had spread quietly, stirring both unease and curiosity among the people. And at the center of it all stood Ayoka, her hands still streaked with the dust and dirt of her labor, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. For days, she had endured the humiliation of eating outdoors, forced to sit beneath the harsh sun and the scrutinizing eyes of the village. But today, something within her had shifted. The quiet support of Dakota, the sympathetic glances of other villagers, and the inner fire of her own dignity had coalesced into a decision she could no longer postpone. Today, she would no longer hide. She would no longer accept the notion that her worth could be dictated by appearances or by the whims of tradition. With measured steps, she carried her bowl of food toward the communal dining area. The chatter of the villagers dimmed as they noticed her approach, the sunlight catching the streaks of dirt on her hands and the frayed edges of her clothing. Some held their breath, unsure what Chayton would do, while others exchanged glances, silently cheering her courage. The moment seemed suspended, the air heavy with expectation. Chayton's eyes widened slightly as Ayoka entered, his voice momentarily caught in his throat. You cannot sit here," he barked, his authority trembling slightly under the weight of her defiance. Ayoka stood firm, setting her bowl carefully on the edge of the table. Her voice, clear and unwavering, carried across the courtyard. "I am not less than anyone here," she said. "I have worked, I have labored, I have given to this village with my hands, my heart, and my strength. If my hands are dirty from honest work, that is not shame, it is honor." A hush fell over the gathering. Villagers leaned forward, their eyes wide, absorbing the power and truth in her words. The children watched with wide-eyed curiosity, seeing a woman who refused to be diminished by fear or humiliation. Even the elder women, who had quietly supported her from the sidelines, felt a swelling pride and relief that someone had finally spoken openly in defense of what was right. Chayton's scowl deepened, but he could see that his rigid authority was faltering. The quiet dissent he had sensed in the villagers' reactions was now manifesting in full view. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught somewhere between tradition and reason, unable to land with the force they once had. Dakota, standing at a respectful distance, watched closely, his eyes filled with quiet pride, knowing that Ayoka's courage was a turning point. Ayoka, sensing the moment, did not back down. She raised her chin, meeting the gaze of the villagers who had once looked away from her suffering. To force someone to eat apart from the community because of dirt on their hands is not wisdom, she continued. It is cruelty, and I refuse to accept it any longer. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. Some villagers nodded in agreement, small but powerful gestures that spoke volumes. Others murmured softly, no longer able to ignore the truth in her words. The ripple of change, seeded by Dakota's courage, had reached full force in Ayoka herself, and it spread outward, touching hearts that had long been silent. Chayton finally turned away, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. His authority had not been entirely broken, but it had been challenged in a way that demanded reflection. For the first time, he could not simply impose his will without question. Ayoka picked up her spoon and began eating alongside the others. The food tasted richer than ever, not because of flavor, but because of the triumph of dignity reclaimed. She was no longer just a passive participant. She had claimed her place openly, and with it, inspired the village to question the fairness of their traditions. As the sun climbed higher and the dust of the courtyard settled, a quiet victory had been won. Ayoka had not only resisted humiliation, but she had also set in motion a change that could ripple through the village for generations, a reminder that courage, truth, and dignity could challenge even the most entrenched authority. The sun had climbed high into the clear desert sky, casting harsh shadows across the village, yet the energy among the villagers was no longer ordinary. After Ayoka's courageous act of defiance, the community was abuzz with attention unlike anything they had felt before. Some felt inspired, others unsettled, and a few even outraged. The seeds of questioning long-held traditions had sprouted, and now they were beginning to grow in full view of everyone. The communal area, which had once been a place of quiet, orderly meals, became the stage for a village-wide debate. People gathered under the shade of the mesquite trees, whispering, gesturing, and sometimes speaking aloud, though always cautiously. The incident with Ayoka had opened a space for dialogue that had previously seemed impossible. No longer could Chaitan's authority go unchallenged, not openly. Dakota, standing slightly apart but clearly engaged, spoke first to the gathering. "We must ask ourselves," he said, his voice calm but firm, "what is the purpose of tradition? Is it to guide us toward justice and honor, or is it to punish those who contribute to the survival of the village simply because they do not conform to a rigid standard?" A murmur of agreement ran through the younger villagers, who had long harbored private doubts about Chaitan's strict rules. Elder women nodded subtly, emboldened by Dakota's words, while some of the men shifted uneasily, caught between respect for tradition and the undeniable truth in what was being said. Ayoka herself spoke next, her voice carrying both confidence and clarity. "I have labored for this village," she said, gesturing to her dirt-streaked hands and worn clothes. "I have gathered herbs, fetched water, and carried firewood. If these acts of service make me unclean in your eyes, then perhaps it is not I who am at fault, but the way we measure worth in this village. Work, honor, and contribution should not be punished. They should be respected." The villagers exchanged glances. Some were moved, others were unsure how to respond. The tension in the air was palpable as long-held norms collided with emerging values of fairness and empathy. Children watched silently, absorbing the lesson being taught in real time, while even elder men, long accustomed to unquestioned authority, found themselves reconsidering the fairness of Chaitan's judgments. Chaitan, sensing the growing unrest, attempted to assert his dominance. "Tradition is our foundation," he barked, his voice echoing across the courtyard. "To question it is to question the survival of our people." Dakota stepped forward calmly. "Tradition is indeed important," he said, "but tradition must not blind us to injustice. A community thrives not only on rules, but on compassion and reason. If our elders lead with cruelty instead of wisdom, then we must guide them back toward justice." The villagers began to speak up, some hesitantly, others with more conviction. "I have always thought it unfair to shame those who work hard," one elder woman admitted. "Perhaps we have been too rigid." Another young man said, "Ayoka has shown us courage. Perhaps we should honor that, not punish it." Even Chaitan could no longer ignore the tide of opinion turning against him. He remained outwardly stern, but the cracks in his authority were visible. The village was no longer a place where one voice could dictate unquestioned compliance. Dialogue, empathy, and courage were beginning to redefine what it meant to belong. By the time the sun began its descent, casting a golden glow across the desert, the debate had accomplished something remarkable. While no single resolution had been declared, the village had begun a transformation. The rigid line between tradition and injustice had blurred, creating space for fairness, dignity, and compassion to take root. Ayoka and Dakota exchanged quiet glances, knowing that the path ahead would still require patience and courage. Yet, for the first time, the community had seen that injustice could be challenged openly and that collective reflection could spark meaningful change. The stage was set for a new chapter in the village's life, one where courage and fairness could finally find a voice among the people. The days that followed, Ayoka's act of defiance were quieter, but beneath the surface, subtle changes were taking hold in the village. The sun rose and fell over the adobe huts as usual, but the rhythm of life had shifted. Whispers of debate lingered in the air, and small, Meaningful gestures began to replace the fear and tension that had long dominated the community. Chaitin, the elder who had once ruled with near absolute authority, found himself increasingly unsettled. He observed the villagers more carefully now, noticing subtle changes he had not anticipated. Young men and women no longer averted their eyes when he walked past, but carried themselves with a quiet confidence that had been absent before. Elder women, who had long submitted silently to his commands, began to offer small signs of support to those who had previously been marginalized. Even children, in their innocent observation, mirrored a new sense of courage in their gestures and movements. Ayoka, for her part, felt a growing sense of empowerment. No longer did she shrink at the thought of dining outdoors. She began to sit alongside her family and others in the communal area without fear, her posture upright, her gaze steady. With each passing day, the villagers' reactions, initially tentative and uncertain, shifted toward acceptance. The simple act of reclaiming her place had begun to ripple outward, challenging the traditional norms that had previously confined her. Takota remained a steady presence, supporting Ayoka quietly yet consistently. He continued to encourage dialogue and reflection among the villagers, ensuring that the momentum of change was maintained. Together, he and Ayoka began to show that courage and empathy could coexist with respect for tradition. Their example inspired others to act in small but meaningful ways. A young woman who had always felt silenced spoke her mind during a gathering. An elder man offered guidance tempered with compassion rather than rigidity, and even children began to advocate for fairness in their own playful yet sincere ways. One afternoon, Chaitin called a meeting with the elder council, his face stern but thoughtful. He had observed the village's subtle transformations and could no longer ignore them. "Perhaps I have been too strict," he admitted, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Perhaps tradition, without compassion, loses its true purpose. We must guide our people, yes, but with wisdom that includes fairness and understanding." The council members nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. It was a small victory, but a pivotal one. The rigid hierarchy that had dictated behavior without question was beginning to evolve. Decisions were no longer solely dictated by fear or authority. Empathy and reason had begun to shape the moral compass of the community. For Ayoka, this change was deeply personal. She had endured public humiliation, been forced to eat outdoors for simply being human, and yet she had emerged not only intact but stronger. Her dignity had been reclaimed, and in doing so, she had created a path for others to challenge injustice in subtle, meaningful ways. The village itself was beginning to recognize the value of compassion alongside tradition. By the end of the day, as the sun dipped behind the desert cliffs and painted the sky in hues of red and gold, the village had transformed in ways that were quiet yet profound. Conversations about fairness and respect were no longer whispered in fear, they were openly discussed, shaping the culture of the community. Ayoka, sitting beside her family with a contented sigh, realized that courage could indeed inspire change, that dignity could triumph over humiliation, and that even the smallest acts of defiance could ignite a movement. And in the cool evening air, as the desert wind rustled the mesquite trees and the first stars appeared above, Ayoka felt a profound sense of belonging. She was no longer defined by the judgments of others, nor confined by outdated rules. She had reclaimed her place, and in doing so, had helped the village begin to transform itself for the better. The village awoke to a crisp morning, the desert sky painted with soft shades of pink and gold as the first light spilled over the adobe huts. Life continued as it always had, but something had undeniably shifted. The subtle undercurrent of tension and change that had begun with Ayoka's defiance had matured into something tangible, a new sense of fairness and community that could no longer be ignored. The villagers moved with a quiet confidence, carrying the lessons of courage and empathy into their daily routines. Ayoka walked through the village, her steps steady and purposeful. Gone was the weight of shame that had once pressed on her shoulders like a heavy stone. Her hands, still marked by dirt from her labors, now symbolized strength, diligence, and resilience rather than disgrace. She passed the communal gathering area and saw families sharing meals freely, some casting supportive glances her way. For the first time, she felt fully integrated not only physically among the villagers, but socially and emotionally accepted for who she truly was. Dakota stood nearby, observing her quietly, pride evident in his calm demeanor. Though he had guided her with gentle encouragement, Ayoka's courage had been her own, the spark that ignited change in the hearts of the villagers. Together, they exchanged a look of understanding. The struggle for dignity was never truly solitary. It relied on courage, solidarity, and a willingness to stand for what is right. Even Chaitin, the elder whose harsh judgments had sparked the initial conflict, had begun to reflect on his actions. He had watched the village adapt, seen the quiet transformations in those around him, and felt a growing understanding of what true leadership meant. Authority, he realized, was not measured solely by control or strict adherence to tradition. It was measured by the ability to guide with fairness, wisdom, and compassion. The weight of his prior rigidity no longer felt like strength. It felt like limitation. In a small but meaningful ceremony, the elders and villagers gathered to share a meal together, and Ayoka was invited to sit at the central table, her place acknowledged without hesitation. The sun cast warm rays over the gathering, highlighting the expressions of quiet joy, relief, and respect on the faces of those present. Ayoka's mother, Nokomis, smiled, her pride shining through her eyes. For her, seeing her daughter claim dignity and respect openly was a moment of triumph that words could not capture. Ayoka spoke briefly to the gathered villagers, her voice steady yet gentle. I have learned that courage is not always loud, and defiance does not always mean conflict. Sometimes it begins quietly, within oneself, and grows through the support of others. Today we have shown that respect, fairness, and compassion can coexist with tradition. May we continue to guide each other with wisdom and empathy. The villagers nodded, some in agreement, others in quiet contemplation. The lessons of injustice, courage, and fairness had left an indelible mark. Children listened intently, absorbing the example of standing for what is right. Young adults felt emboldened to question unfairness in ways that were respectful yet assertive. Elders began to reconcile tradition with the evolving needs of their community. As the meal continued, Ayoka noticed Chaitin watching her with a new expression, one of understanding rather than judgment. He approached her quietly after the meal and said, "You have taught me more than I ever imagined, Ayoka. Perhaps I have been blind to the harm my strictness caused. Your courage has reminded me that true honor lies in justice, not fear." Ayoka nodded, recognizing the significance of his words. Change, she realized, was not merely about defiance, it was about awakening others to fairness and compassion. Together with Dakota, and with the slowly transforming village around her, she felt the deep satisfaction of a struggle, not only endured but transformed into hope and progress. As the sun set behind the desert cliffs, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Ayoka sat beside her family, the wind whispering through the mesquite trees. The village had been changed, not overnight, but through quiet courage, solidarity, and the willingness to question injustice. She had claimed her dignity, inspired her community, and shown that even in the shadow of tradition, fairness and empathy could prevail. For the first time, Ayoka felt a profound sense of peace and belonging, the triumph of her spirit mirrored in the awakening hearts of those around her.